which has always been a mouthpiece of successive Egyptian regimes. Is this contributing, do you think, to the reaching of a kind of critical mass of opposition to President Mubarak?
There is a revolt happening today in Egypt across all state newspapers by journalists against their pro-government editors. And definitely many of the figures who are in the government that the regime was trying to co-opt are in such a critical position that they feel the heat. So we expect actually more resignations to come, and that will only give boost to the protests.
How do you think the next couple of days are going to figure in the general protest movement?
The coming couple of days will be crucial for our uprising, since it's not only middle-class protesters or protesters who do not necessarily enjoy economic power, but we're talking here about millions of Egyptian workers who hold the economic power will be taking part, and that's enough for us, I think, to cripple the regime.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the line, Egyptian blogger Hossam El-Hamalawi. Now, the US is now warning Mubarak's government to make the reforms Egyptians are calling for. On Wednesday, President Obama spoke to Saudi Arabia's King Abdullah about the crisis. He stressed the importance of a meaningful and lasting transition of power in Egypt. From Washington, our White House correspondent Patty Culhane has more.
On the streets of Egypt, the protesters make their point with their presence. In Washington, D.C., the message is being sent from this podium, a list of demands.
Lifting the emergency law. One of them is our constitutional changes so that we get toward free and fair elections. But I think it's obvious that they've yet to meet the threshold.
The response from Egypt sent through the American media. The U.S. can't tell Egypt what to do.
How can you ask me to disband that emergency law while I'm in difficulty? Give me time, allow me to have control, to stabilize the nation, to stabilize the state, and then we would look into the issue.
The Egyptian foreign minister raising the possibility of the military taking over. To that, the Obama administration responded that aid could be on the line.
We will evaluate their responses to and their level of restraint will be evaluated as we make decisions on our aid.
The Obama administration is also reportedly facing pressure by Israel to stop pushing for Mubarak's departure. At the White House Wednesday, Defense Minister Ehud Barak in high-level meetings on Egypt. WikiLeaks cables show who they want to be in charge. The U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv saying in 2008 that when Mubarak steps down, quote, there is no question that Israel is most comfortable with the prospect of Omar Suleiman. In another cable, a U.S. diplomat writes, quote, Suleiman told us Egypt wants Gaza to go hungry but not starve. Saying, quote, in their moments of greatest frustration, Tantawi and Suleiman each have claimed that the IDF would be welcome to reinvade Philadelphia if the IDF thought that would stop the smuggling. The new Egyptian vice president, up until Wednesday, the Obama administration's very public choice to lead the orderly transition, now beginning to temper their public praise. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
A recent Reuters poll asked Americans to rate the importance of encouraging democracy in the Middle East. Let's take a look at the results. About a third of people asked said that the United States should always support democracy in the Middle East, regardless of the risk to American security, while 58% backed a cautious approach, anxious that democracy could result in the election of Islamist governments that do not back U.S. interests. The protests in Egypt have prompted other governments in the region to take action. Jordan's King Abdullah has sworn in a new government. The reshuffle follows protests by thousands of people calling for change in the country. The ex-Army Chief General Maruf Bakhit becomes the new Prime Minister and says he'll introduce widespread reforms. As Egypt waits for democratic transition, Tunisia, the country where the wave of change began, still facing criticism from human rights groups. Despite a promise to release all political prisoners, around 1,000 are still in custody. Nazanin Mashiri reports.
The Ben Sheikhs are waiting for the release of their son. Nour el-Haq is a political prisoner, serving a 3-year sentence. Convicted under Tunisian anti-terror laws for publishing banned materials online, his family say he's innocent and was targeted for his religious beliefs.
It is so unjust. All these kids have done is be good Muslims. Religion here is a crime. Having a beard is a crime. Wearing a veil is a crime.
Najia says her son, the youngest in the family, has been harassed by the secret police since he was 14.
Imagine they put him with criminals. Imagine what I feel when my son used to live in a clean environment and now lives in a horrid place.
Mohammed Abu knows what that's like. He was a political prisoner under Ben Ali, detained for 16 months for writing an article critical of the regime.
Prisoners would be taken out by night in the winter, naked. They were tortured and beaten. They were made to imitate chicken sounds or animals. The aim was to destroy the morale of the prisoners.
Things are different now. Ben Ali is gone. A new caretaker government says it will promote freedom of speech and democracy. But it's not easy reversing years of dictatorship. One of the first promises made by this new interim government was an amnesty for all political prisoners. Some detainees have been released and others escaped in the days following Ben Ali's fall. But the authorities have failed to do anything about those convicted under Tunisia's anti-terrorism laws. The former president, Ben Ali, was an important American ally in their war on terror. But human rights groups say the law was used as an excuse to oppress the opposition.
They were not convicted of committing any terrorist acts or possessing explosives. They were usually convicted for either talking about going to Iraq to join the jihad or talking about going to Somalia. And so, in other words, they were convicted for their intentions and not for their acts.
A new emergency law gives the acting president powers to release all political prisoners. The Ben Sheikhs hope this weekly journey to visit their son in jail will be their last. Nazanin Mashiri, Al Jazeera, Tunis.
Families in Egypt are also paying the price for standing up to their government. We'll meet one family that remains dedicated to the demonstrations despite the loss of their son and brother. That's coming up later on the Al Jazeera News Hour. To other news, and the Philippine government's resumed peace talks with Muslim separatists. A spokesman for the Moro Islamic Liberation Front says that he's optimistic about negotiating an end to the decades-long conflict. But as Marga Ortigas reports, there's dissent within the rank and file of the MILF.
Ligawasan Marsh, a resource-rich battlefield. Long an enclave of the separatist Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF, it was once difficult to get in without the group's say-so. But not anymore.
1,000 fighters in this one camp used to be affiliated with the MILF. Over the past couple of years, they have jumped ship and joined forces with the Moro National Liberation Front. They say more and more of them are doing so, growing frustrated and disheartened with the MILF leadership.
For these fighters, it's a return to the mother group. The MILF broke away from the Philippines' original Muslim separatist movement, the MNLF, back in the 70s, when a peace deal was first struck with the government. But the MILF's pursuit of its own peace deal has not been as successful. Despite its leader's statements to the contrary, many of the ground troops grew restless.
They say too much, but accomplish nothing.
Now able to visit Ligawasan, the MNLF chairman is welcomed warmly in this former MILF camp. Even if many consider the original peace deal he brokered a failure, he is still seen here as a hero.
I am euphoric about this because I think this is a sign, a signal from the Almighty God that now our people have finally learned a big lesson, namely that only when they are united that they can be free.
Another camp where MILF fighters have turned, believing the group's leaders to be ineffective and detached. Misuwari says that more than half of the MILF's 12,000 troops have now rejoined the MNLF, something the MILF leadership denies.
That's too exaggerated. We were able to sustain them, the strength on the ground, no problem at all.
Here in the MILF heartland, the finishing touches are being put on what's to be the largest mosque in the country. Construction stalled 3 years ago. Around the same time, MILF peace talks with the government fell through. Site engineers got over their hurdles, but it's back to the drawing board for the MILF. Until the leaders face the discontent of their own ground forces, any deal discussions with the government now will be nothing more than cosmetic. Marga Ortigas, Al Jazeera, Cotabato, Southern Philippines.
Talks between the North and South Korean military have broken down. Neither side could agree on the agenda for future discussions. Tension's been high on the peninsula since the North shelled a South Korean island in November, killing 4 people. Thailand and Cambodia will present their arguments over a border dispute to the United Nations next week. Both countries blame each other for damage to an ancient Hindu temple located at the center of recent military clashes. At least 11 people have died in the fighting and thousands have fled their homes. Turning now to other news from Washington, D.C. and the Americas, here's Shihab Ratansi.
Thanks, Veronica. We begin with the U.S. House of Representatives voting down a Republican plan to retrieve millions of dollars overpaid to the United Nations. Quashing the measure was a victory for the Obama administration, but the vote is indicative of a new era of United Nations bashing in Washington. Kristen Salumi explains.
The House will come to order.
With the U.S. Congress on the hunt for ways to cut costs and close a projected $1.5 trillion budget deficit, House Republicans are turning to a familiar whipping boy, the United Nations.
The UN has been a scandal-ridden mess for as far back as I can remember.
On Wednesday, some House Republicans demanded the UN